The day began as usual. The sun's rays broke through the clouds, filling the city parking lot with soft light. Jessica stood outside her old car, carefully stacking her purchases in the trunk. Her dog, Bruno, a large and calm Labrador, sat beside her, watching carefully. Everything was going as it should until he showed up. A police patrol car braked sharply at the edge of the parking lot, and a uniformed man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, his badge bore his name, Officer Randolph. His gait betrayed a self-assurance bordering on aggression. He strode straight toward Jessica, as if he knew he'd found another victim for his power. "Hey, you?" A gruff voice broke the silence. "Is this your car?" Jessica turned around, nodding confusedly. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" Randolph approached her slowly, looking down at her with contempt. His eyes read everything: distrust, condemnation, latent hatred. He was clearly enjoying every second of his superiority. "The plates on your car are expired," he said with icy certainty. "That can't be," Jessica said in surprise. "I just renewed them. I have the receipt." "A receipt?" he interrupted sarcastically. "Of course you have a receipt. You're the kind of guy who always forgets to pay his bills." Her heart clenched. That tone, those words. She'd encountered this kind of attitude many times before, but each time it hit her where it hurt the most. "Please, give me a moment. I'll find the document," she said, trying to remain calm, though her voice trembled slightly. But Randolph didn't even try to listen. He walked around the car, tapping the hood as if looking for a reason to complain. Then he noticed Bruno. "And what kind of beast is that?" he asked, pointing to the dog. "It's my dog," Jessica replied, trying to speak as softly as possible. "Are you sure he's registered?" Randolph asked with a venomous smile. "You know, I've seen dogs like that used for illegal business." "What? No!" Jessica was shocked. "Bruno is just my friend. He wouldn't hurt anyone." "A friend, then?" He grinned, looking at her as if her words were nothing. "Well, we'll see how long you'll be friends when I call animal control." Jessica felt anger boiling in her chest. This was too much. But before she could answer, Randolph continued. "Look, lady, you're already breaking a lot of rules. Expired plates, potentially dangerous animal. Maybe I should just take your car right now, or maybe I should detain you. How long do you think you'll be able to avoid the consequences?" His words were calculated to break her. Each sentence penetrated her soul, turning a simple situation into a disaster. Bruno, sensing the tension, stood up slightly, looking at the officer intently. "Please," Jessica tried to speak calmly, though her voice was trembling. "You're wrong. Give me a chance to explain." But Randolph was adamant. He stepped closer so that there was almost no space between them. "I know your kind," he hissed in her face. "You think you can do whatever you want until someone stops you. Well, today's your lucky day, because I'm here to fix that." At that moment, Jessica realized he's not looking for justice. He needs to show power. He needs to humiliate her. She glanced at Bruno, who growled quietly, warning but not attacking. The policeman noticed this and grinned. "Keep your dog under control," he said. "Otherwise I'll do it for you." Jessica knew this was just the beginning. Randolph stood in front of Jessica like a giant outshining the light. He took a step back, folded his arms defiantly across his chest, and slowly, dismissively, looked her over from head to toe. His gaze was like a blade slicing her dignity apart. "You know," he began, this time with ostentatious reflection, "you're all the same. You think you can just drive around other people's neighborhoods without paying attention to the laws. Do you ever follow the rules at all?" Jessica felt her hands clench into fists, but she inhaled deeply, trying to keep herself from bursting into anger. She knew it would only make things worse. "I'm not breaking any laws," she said as calmly as she could, though her voice gave away her anxiety. "And I want you to speak to me with respect." "Respect?" Randolph snorted as if he'd heard a joke. "You're demanding respect here? That's ridiculous. If you deserved it, you wouldn't be parking here and carrying that beast." He turned again to Bruno, who now stood up as if instinctively sensing a threat. The Labrador watched the officer's every move tensely, his muscles trembling slightly in readiness to protect his mistress. "Oh, he's aggressive, too," Randolph grinned, looking at the dog, but his words were directed at Jessica. "I wonder how many of these friends grow up without proper supervision and turn into dangerous killers. Or maybe you're training him like that on purpose. Training him for a black fight?" Jessica awed, not believing her ears. "You have no right to say such things," she said, finally unable to bear it. "I don't have the right?" Randolph took a step closer, his face now only a few centimeters from hers. "Do you know your rights? Or do you think the laws are on your side?" He'd said it with emphasis, intent on humiliating her and robbing her of all confidence. Jessica felt her feet digging into the pavement. She wanted to answer, but every word seemed powerless against his authority and cold contempt. "Listen to me," he continued, his tone lower but only more threatening. "You're nothing. Just another—" He paused, as if choosing exactly how to jab her. "Just another, shall we say, potential criminal, just waiting to be caught. You think you can come in here and act like you're allowed to do anything?" Jessica tried to gather her thoughts. "This is not your neighborhood. I live here. I'm a citizen like everyone else," she said, but her voice sounded muffled under the weight of his accusations. "You're not like the others," he interrupted coldly. "You never have been, and you know it very well." The officer's words cut like a knife. Jessica realized he was deliberately using his position to make her feel insignificant. But worst of all, she could see that he was enjoying it. His gaze glowed with malicious satisfaction. "Now listen," he added, grinning at her desperate face. "You have two choices. Either you pack up that dog of yours and get out of here, or I call for backup. Trust me, I won't have any trouble finding a couple of violations to take you right out of here." "You have no grounds for—" she began, but he interrupted her, laughing. "Grounds?" He laughed loudly and angrily. "I have all the grounds. You're the foundation." Jessica felt her insides clench with powerlessness. Bruno, sensing her tension, stepped closer and stood between her and the officer, growling slightly. "Oh, so you've decided to set him on me," Randolph shrieked, pulling his baton from his belt. "Go ahead, try it. Let's see what the court says then." At that moment, Jessica realized that the situation was getting out of control. She felt a cold sweat run down her back, but she couldn't leave. Giving in to him would mean admitting defeat, accepting his humiliation, and letting him feel even more powerful. She lifted her head, trying to look confident, even though everything inside was screaming with fear. "You are exceeding your authority, officer," she said firmly. His face tensed, irritation flashing in his eyes for a second, but then he grinned again, leaning closer. "Authority," he whispered. "I am the law." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Jessica realized he wasn't going to stop. And though her patience was on the fritz, she knew this was only the beginning. The officer's shouts and Jessica's tense tone began to attract the attention of passers-by. People slowed their steps, turning to look at the scene, but no one stopped. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and reluctance to get involved. The cars in the parking lot also froze, their drivers watching from behind the windows, not making a single movement. "Oh, look at that," Randolph grinned, nodding toward a few gawkers. "You've even got an audience. But you know what the best part is? No one will stand up for you, because nobody cares." His words hit harder than she'd expected. Jessica looked around. The crowd was starting to thicken. A couple of women carrying bags from the supermarket, a man in a suit with a briefcase, a group of teenagers with phones in their hands. They watched, but their faces were blank. No judgment, no support, just cold observation, like a scene from a movie. "Do you seriously not see what's going on?" suddenly burst out of her mouth. She turned to the crowd, trying to find a single ally. "He's overstepping his authority. This is wrong." But no one moved. Some averted their eyes, others took a step back. Jessica noticed one of the teenagers start filming what was happening on his phone, but instead of support, it only increased her sense of isolation. "Yeah, go ahead," Randolph said sarcastically, nodding at the guy with the phone. "Maybe you'll become an internet star, but people like you are too used to cameras, aren't they?" Jessica didn't know what to say to that. Every word he said was like a punch in the face, another layer of humiliation. She turned toward the crowd, trying again to find help. "Somebody, this is wrong. He has no right to talk to me like that." There was silence in response. The man with the briefcase shook his head briefly and turned away, as if afraid that eye contact would make him part of the problem. The woman with the bags whispered something to her companion, clearly offensive, and they both walked away quickly. "See?" Randolph grinned, making a broad gesture toward the crowd. "They know their place. Maybe you should follow their example." His words burned her from the inside out, but she stood, gritting her teeth stubbornly. "You won't get what you want," she said quietly but firmly. "And I already got one," he said, his face lighting up with a wicked smile. He turned to the car again, but this time it was the trunk and grocery bags that caught his attention. "Let's see what you've got here," he said, reaching into the trunk without permission. "You have no right to touch my things." Jessica took a step forward, but froze when he turned around, grabbing his baton. "One more step, and you'll be sorry," he hissed, showing he was ready to use force. Her body stiffened and thoughts whirled in her head. She knew that any action she took could be used against her. She looked at the crowd, hoping someone would intervene, but the faces around her remained indifferent. "Why do you stand there and do nothing?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with despair. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." One of the teenagers filming on his phone hummed and turned the camera back to his company. A few others seemed to be just enjoying the spectacle. The crowd was beginning to look like judges, silently deciding its fate. Randolph continued his actions. He opened the trunk, ostentatiously pulling out one of the bags. "So, what do we have here?" he said, rummaging through her things as if they were his property. Jessica couldn't take it anymore. She took another step forward, but Bruno suddenly growled, loud and threatening. It stopped her, and, for a moment, even Randolph. "Are you saying you're going to attack a policeman?" he asked, looking at the dog. "That's fine. That will give me every reason to shoot you." These words made the crowd come to life. Some began to talk among themselves. A woman on the sidelines whispered, "She asked for it." and a man with a briefcase said to someone, "Why would she even bother with him?" Jessica felt the ground go from under her feet. She was surrounded by people, but none of them were on her side. She stood alone, like a public enemy, in front of this man who was deliberately ruining her life. "Look," she said, trying to control her voice. "This is just wrong. Please stop." Randolph laughed, his voice echoing through the parking lot. "Wrong? You don't even know what that means. You don't know what it means to be on the right side of the law. People like you are always looking for a way around it." Her patience was at an end. The crowd remained a silent witness to her humiliation, and Randolph continued to press, increasing his power. "No one's going to help you," he said, throwing the stuff back into the trunk, "because you've already lost." But Jessica knew one thing. She couldn't give up. Though her voice trembled, her inner fire began to ignite. It was only the beginning, but deep down she felt that justice would find its way, no matter how hard it was. Bruno stood next to Jessica like a stone wall. His powerful body tensed, his eyes focused on the policeman, but he didn't make a sound. Only his ears twitched slightly, catching every sound and movement of Officer Randolph. He looked calm on the outside, but on the inside he was like a tensioned bowstring, ready to fire at any moment. Randolph cast a brief glance at the dog and grinned. "What? Are you going to scare me with your protector?" His voice was challenging, but there was a touch of wariness in it. Jessica put her hand on Bruno's head, trying to calm herself and the dog at the same time. She knew that her faithful friend understood every emotion, every hint of threat. He had always been her rock in her most difficult moments, but now she could feel his tension growing. "He's not a threat if you don't make one," she said firmly. "Oh, is that so?" Randolph stretched out, turning his attention back to the dog. "We'll see about that." He took a step forward, deliberately shortening the distance between him and Bruno. The dog didn't move, but his gaze became even more focused. Randolph leaned a little lower, as if trying to elicit a reaction, his face lighting up in a wry smile. "You're just a piece of meat," he said as if talking to a dog. "If I wanted to, you'd be under my feet in a second." Jessica felt her fingers gripping the leash tighter. Bruno growled softly, the sound low, almost indistinguishable, but still enough to send shivers down the spines of those nearby. Randolph straightened, grinning. "Oh, great. Here comes the trouble. I think I'll call animal control. These animals shouldn't be in public places." "Don't you dare touch him." Jessica stepped forward, instinctively protecting the dog. "Then get him out of my way," he said sharply. "If he makes a move toward me, it will be the last thing he does." Bruno continued to watch Randolph's every movement. His powerful chest heaved evenly, but Jessica knew it was only an appearance. He was on edge, ready to defend her as soon as he felt the threat becoming real. The policeman stepped close to Jessica. His high boots clattered on the pavement. He stopped deliberately so that the dog was between them. Bruno tilted his head slightly to the side, his eyes fixed on the man. "You do realize this dog is a threat, right?" Randolph said. "And I have every right to disarm it if I see fit." "He's not a threat," Jessica replied sharply, her voice shaking with anger. "The only threat here is you." Randolph laughed, but his laugh was no longer as confident as before. Bruno stepped forward, his powerful paws light on the pavement, and the movement made Randolph tense. "Get back," he shouted, throwing up his hand, but Jessica yanked the leash back. "Bruno, stop," she said softly, her voice quiet but confident. The dog immediately stopped, obeying. His body remained motionless, but his gaze remained as sharp as a knife. Randolph froze, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered it back to his belt. "Well, we'll see who's who," he said with a wry chuckle, though there was a slight note of uncertainty in his voice now. At that moment, Jessica noticed that the crowd had tensed up as well. Some people were whispering about what was happening, and the teenagers were still filming on their phones. But now there was fear in their eyes of a possible escalation. "Bruno," she said again, looking at the dog. His gaze met hers for a moment, and she realized that he was fully prepared to act if necessary. But she didn't want that. "He's under control," she said, turning to Randolph. "He's not the problem." "The problem is always people like you," he snapped, but he didn't make any more sudden moves. Bruno remained as still as a statue. But Jessica knew that this silence was temporary, and she could only hope that the dog could hold back his instincts a little longer, because she knew that once he moved, there would be no turning back. Randolph circled slowly around Jessica and Bruno like a predator playing with prey. The crowd around them grew even tighter, but no one interfered. His voice, oozing venom, cut through the air again. "What? You don't have the words? It's always like that with you. As soon as you're pressed, you turn into little, pathetic victims." Jessica gripped Bruno's leash tighter, but her hands trembled. Every word the officer said was a blow. She tried to control herself, but inside she was seething. "You have no right to talk to me like that," she said, trying to remain calm, but her voice trembled. "Oh, I do," Randolph grinned. "You gave me that right when you parked your rusty wreck here, and don't give me any of your rights stories. Your rights end where the laws begin." He approached the car and kicked the bumper without warning. The impact was loud and sharp, like an explosion. "What are you doing?" Jessica shouted, stepping forward. "I'm examining your law-abidingness," he replied dryly. "Although, looking at this bucket of nuts, it's clear. You don't even have money to pay for repairs. But that's what people like you are used to, isn't it?" Jessica felt her chest tighten with humiliation and anger. His words weren't just harsh, they hit her where it hurt. She struggled to hold back tears. "Enough!" she shouted. Randolph turned sharply, and gloating satisfaction flashed in his eyes. "What did you say?" His voice got lower, but even more threatening. "You think you can order me around?" He came close to her so she could smell his tobacco and cheap coffee. "You're in no position to tell me what to do," he hissed. "Forget your fantasies of equality. You will always be a step below. Understand?" Those words were the last straw. Something inside Jessica snapped. "You're nothing!" she shouted, clenching her fists. Her voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. "You use your power to humiliate people because inside you are an empty and pathetic person." The crowd froze. Her words echoed across the parking lot, and even the teenagers with their phones stopped filming. Randolph froze for a second, but then his face contorted with anger. "Ah, you've made up your mind, have you?" He stepped closer, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you can say that to me?" He raised his baton, showing it to Jessica as if to warn her. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Bruno immediately growled, louder and more threatening. His growl echoed through the parking lot, causing a few people in the crowd to step back. "Calm your mutt down," Randolph hissed, "or I'll do it for you." "If you so much as lay a finger on my dog," she began, but he interrupted her. "You'll do nothing," he said with contempt. "You're nothing, and your dog is nothing. One team of losers." He turned to the car again and opened its door without warning. Then he roughly flipped the seat over, pulling out the bag that lay inside. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered, searching through her things playfully. "Stop it! This is illegal!" Jessica shouted, running toward the car, but Randolph turned around with such speed that she stopped. "I said back!" he bellowed, raising his baton. Jessica stepped back, her breathing quickening. She glanced at the crowd, but no one was moving. Her eyes met Bruno's again. There was something deep, instinctive in his gaze. She knew he was waiting for her signal, but she also knew that if he interfered, the consequences would be dire. "Look at you," Randolph continued, savoring the moment. "A pathetic woman trying to play the heroine. But we both know the truth. You'll always be the one standing on the sidelines while the world passes you by." He leaned closer, his face almost touching hers. "And if your mutt decides he can do something about it..." He raised the baton slowly, running it over his hand. "It would be his last mistake." Bruno growled louder and louder, and the tension around him became unbearable. Jessica stood with her teeth clenched, her hands clenched on the leash. She couldn't take it anymore, but she knew this moment could be the point of no return. The atmosphere was heated to the limit. Bruno stood in front of Jessica like her living wall, tense but ready to act at any moment. His growls grew louder, and his powerful paws seemed to dig into the ground. He was the epitome of calm menace, but even that control could explode at a moment's notice. Randolph, seeing this, grinned. His eyes burned with excitement, as if he had just found a new toy to break. "What? You think your dog can scare me?" he said contemptuously, pointing his baton at Bruno. "Believe me, I've seen them before. They bark loudly, but when it comes to the real thing, they're nothing, like their masters." Jessica felt her breath hitching, but she gritted her teeth. "Put the baton away," she shouted, stepping forward. "He didn't do anything to you." "Not yet," Randolph parried, looking at Bruno with a sinister grin. "But who knows what that monster is capable of?" He slowly began to move closer, holding the baton as if he was ready to use it at any second. Bruno ducked slightly, his tail low and his growl deeper. It was a warning sound, but Randolph clearly chose to ignore it. "I said, get back," he shouted, waving his baton in front of the dog's face. Bruno didn't move. His eyes were focused on the baton, but his instincts made him control every movement. "That's not your job," Jessica shouted, trying to intervene again. "You're threatening him for no reason." "No reason." The policeman turned to her, his face contorted with anger. "The threat is right in front of me, and if that beast makes one false move, I'll take him down." He turned to Bruno again and swung his baton, lunging sharply toward the dog to startle him. Bruno reacted instantly, retreating half a step, but his snarling became even louder, sharper, like thunder. "Aha, there it is," Randolph said, stepping back and laughing. "Do you see it? That animal is dangerous. You can't leave it outside." Jessica couldn't hold back any longer. "That's enough. You have no right," she shouted, her voice full of anger and despair. "I have every right," he replied coldly, approaching Bruno again. "If I decide this animal is a threat, I'll get rid of it, right here and now." He reached for the holster on his belt, and Jessica gasped as she realized what he intended to do. "No!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a bolt of lightning. "You wouldn't dare." Randolph froze for a moment, casting a cold glance at her. "Let's see what your dog says when he hears the sound of a gunshot," he said, moving closer to the animal again. Bruno roared so loudly that the sound seemed to shake the air. Some of the crowd backed away, clearly frightened. The teenagers who had been shooting the video before began whispering, debating whether to stop recording and move away. Randolph, as if savoring this moment, made another lunge with his club, now directly toward Bruno's muzzle. And that was a mistake. Bruno jerked forward with lightning speed, making a quick but controlled lunge. He didn't attack, but his fangs snapped through the air, only an inch from the baton. The movement was a warning, but its power and speed made even Randolph freeze for a moment. "You decided to scare me, didn't you?" shouted the policeman, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "Come on, try it." Jessica yanked the leash back in a panic, pulling Bruno closer to her. "This is not an attack," she shouted, her voice full of despair. "It's your fault. You're provoking him." Randolph, breathing hard, stepped back for a moment. Then he pulled out his walkie-talkie and pressed a button. "Need support," he pronounced into her. "Aggressive animal, possibly attacking, need immediate assistance." The crowd began to bustle. Some people moved farther away, but most continued to watch. "You saw the whole thing," Jessica shouted to the audience. "He attacked us first. This is a provocation." But her answer was silence. None of the gawkers were going to interfere. No one made a move to help her or even say a word in her defense. Randolph raised his baton again, his face contorted with anger. "It's your own fault for bringing this on. And you know what? I'm going to end this story right now." He stepped forward, but at that moment Bruno barked loudly like thunder. It was a warning so powerful that even Randolph seemed to feel its force. Jessica realized the situation was about to explode, and all she could do was pray that Bruno would hold back his instinct and someone in the crowd would finally intervene. But so far, no one had moved. Randolph took another step forward, his baton raised, ready to fall on Bruno. The crowd froze, some watching with horror, others with morbid curiosity, but no one intervened. Jessica stood as if on a powder keg, her heart beating so loudly she thought she could hear it echoing. "Bruno, no, stop!" she shouted, clutching the leash so tightly that her fingers turned white. But it was useless. The policeman made one last mistake. Too close, too aggressive. Bruno, who had been holding back until then, finally broke loose. His body, like a spring-tensioned mechanism, unfolded, and he rushed forward with lightning speed. His growl turned into a battle cry that made even the bravest in the crowd retreat a step. Randolph, though confident of his superiority, had clearly not expected this. The second Bruno was in the air, he had only time to raise his club to defend himself. But the dog was faster. Bruno's powerful jaws closed on his hand, with which the policeman held the baton. The sound was frighteningly loud. The snap of teeth and the crunch of cloth mixed with Randolph's scream. He fell on his back, twitching and screaming in pain. But Bruno didn't let go. "Get your goddamn dog off me!" he shrieked, trying to fight back with his other hand. But it was useless. Bruno acted with precision and fury, as if every instinct in him said, "I'm protecting my family." His weight and strength were too great for Randolph to free himself. Jessica watched in horror. "Bruno, that's enough," she shouted, but her voice sounded too weak against the officer's shouts and the commotion of the crowd. "That's a bit much," said someone watching, but no one even thought to come closer. Randolph tried to reach for his belt where the gun hung, but Bruno sensed the movement. He abruptly released his hand and moved to the policeman's hip, snatching at his belt with a snarl. His powerful teeth easily ripped the weapon from its holster, tossing it aside. "Stop it," "I command you," Randolph shouted, but his words were drowned in panic. At that moment, something clicked in the minds of the crowd. Those who had been watching silently until then began to talk among themselves. "It's too much," said one man. "But it was his own fault. He provoked the dog." "That cop deserved it," remarked one of the teens who continued filming. "What if he shoots the dog?" said the woman hiding behind her car. Bruno, meanwhile, had released his belt and stood in front of Jessica again, towering between her and Randolph. He had no intention of retreating. His gaze was fixed on the lying officer, who was now writhing in pain, trying to rise. Randolph, breathing heavily, rose with difficulty to his knees, his hand hanging powerless and his eyes burning with rage. You think that's it?" he hissed, struggling to get to his feet. "You and your damn dog are going to pay for this." He staggered, taking a step toward Jessica, but Bruno roared again, loud and threatening. The sound was so powerful it sent shivers down some of the crowd's spines. "Stop!" Jessica shouted, putting her hand forward as if to block the officer. Her voice was as firm as ever. One more step, and he'd attack again. Randolph froze. For a moment his face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. He looked around for support, but the crowd no longer looked indifferent. There was anger in some people's eyes, condemnation in others, and some seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. "Somebody call the police," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "Can't you see? That dog is dangerous." "You are the police," came someone's sarcastic voice. Jessica felt her fear begin to give way to anger. "You provoked this," she said, her voice cold and clear. "You attacked us. And now that you've gotten what you deserve, you want to appear to be the victim?" Randolph answered nothing. His gaze returned to Bruno, who stood still, growling but not moving forward. It was the look of a victor, confident and formidable. Sirens began to wail somewhere in the distance. Someone in the crowd had probably called for reinforcements after all. "Let's see how you explain it," Randolph said, his voice filled with hatred but with a note of fear. "You'll have to explain," Jessica said sharply. She looked at him directly, without a shadow of doubt. "We all saw what you did." The teens picked up their cell phones. "And this video will explain everything else too," one of them added, raising the camera so Randolph could see. Randolph took a step back, his face pale. He no longer looked like the cocky predator he had been only a few minutes before. Now he was a hunted beast, surrounded by the consequences of his actions. Bruno didn't move, his growling gradually quieted. He knew his work was done. Jessica felt a wave of relief run down her spine. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around Bruno's neck. "Thank you, friend," she whispered, her voice trembling but with gratitude in it. The sirens were getting closer. Justice, it seemed, was finally beginning to awaken. Officer Randolph lay on the pavement, his breathing heavy, his face contorted with pain. His arm, which Bruno had just freed, was trembling and bleeding. The crowd began to come to life, as if waking up from shock. The whispers and negotiations grew louder, and even those who had averted their eyes could not take their eyes off what was happening. "He attacked the dog first," someone said loudly. "It's all on video, I saw it," added another voice from the crowd. Randolph, hearing these words, tried to rise, but his body protested. His left arm dangled limply, like a rag doll, and his right hand, clenched into a fist, rested on the ground. He looked around, his eyes darting around like a hunted animal. "You," he wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at Jessica. "You're going to pay for this, and your damn dog, too." But his words sounded weaker than he intended. Instead of a threat, it sounded like a desperate attempt to regain the control he'd irrevocably lost. "You threatened us," Jessica said firmly, her voice louder and more confident than she'd expected. "You provoked it." She stood beside Bruno, who now sat at her feet, still wary but calm. His tense body gradually relaxed, but his gaze remained fixed on Randolph. "It's an attack!" Randolph shouted again, his voice breaking. "You saw it! That dog attacked me!" He looked around the crowd again, hoping to find support, but there was no response to his words. On the contrary, the people began to talk louder and louder. "Come on, we saw the whole thing," said the man in the suit who had been standing off to the side. "You're the one who provoked the dog." "You're the one who started it," added the teenager with the cell phone. "I have it all written down." The crowd gradually began to shift toward Jessica. Their gazes, previously full of fear or indifference, now reflected sympathy. Some even began to applaud quietly, as if recognizing that justice had been done, albeit in an unusual way. Randolph, hearing the applause, turned even paler. He realized that he was losing control not only of the situation, but also of his perception of his power. "You don't understand," he tried to shout, but his voice was no longer convincing. "I was trying to protect you. That dog was a threat." "The only threat here is you," Jessica said, stepping forward. Her words drew cheers from the crowd. Randolph clenched his teeth, his eyes darting to the radio on his belt. But even if he called for backup, it wouldn't give him back the crowd's respect he'd just lost. The siren still sounded somewhere in the distance, approaching too slowly. Randolph tried to rise, leaning on his healthy arm, but fell again, clutching his side. "Do you think this is the end?" he wheezed, glaring at Jessica. His voice was filled with anger, but there wasn't a shred of confidence in it. "I'm going to have you and your dog dragged through the courts anyway." Jessica looked down at him. Her fear, which hadn't let her go from the beginning, was now replaced by cold anger. "Do what you want," she said, "but no one will support you this time. People have seen the truth." The crowd began to move closer, as if shielding her and Bruno from a possible threat. Several people stood beside her. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Someone offered to call a lawyer. Even those who had just been watching now decided to support her. Randolph saw it. He saw how the men he had thought were silent witnesses were now united against him, his face contorted with a mixture of pain, anger, and powerlessness. "It's a mistake," he muttered, lowering his head. "The mistake was yours," replied the man with the briefcase closest to me. "We all saw how you treated that woman and her dog, and we won't forget." Randolph answered nothing. He sat down on the pavement, his head falling helplessly on his chest. The crowd was no longer afraid of him. When the patrol car finally arrived, the officers ran out of it, surprised by the scene. One of them quickly approached Randolph, who whispered something to him, pointing to Jessica. But when the officer raised his eyes and faced the crowd, his face expressed doubt. "We saw the whole thing," said someone in the crowd. "We have proof." "Check the records," the teen added, picking up the phone. The officers looked at each other, then one of them walked over to Jessica. "We'll figure it out," he said. Jessica just nodded. Her body trembled with fatigue, but she knew this was a day she would remember for a long time. She squatted down and hugged Bruno, whispering, "You did the right thing, man. You did the right thing." Bruno licked her hand lightly, as if to say, "I'm always here for you." And Randolph, sitting on the pavement surrounded by his own infamy, realized that his power, which he thought was unquestionable, had crumbled to dust. Randolph sat on the cold asphalt, breathing heavily. His body ached with pain, his arm throbbed from Bruno's bite, and his tattered uniform bore witness to his humiliation. The crowd around him no longer looked at him with respect or fear. People who had previously feared his power now saw him only as a weak, pathetic man. The officers who arrived on the scene gently helped him up. One of them, young and clearly just beginning his police career, supported him by the shoulder, but he could barely contain his confusion. "Officer Randolph, what happened here?" the senior patrolman asked, looking at him in disbelief. "That's her," Randolph shouted sharply, pointing at Jessica. "She sicked the dog on me. That dog is a menace and must be destroyed." The crowd buzzed like beehives. People were talking, and Randolph's words were drowned in the indignant voices. "It's a lie," shouted one of the gawkers. "He provoked her," the man with the briefcase added, stepping forward. "We saw the whole thing, and we have the tapes." The teen, who had been holding the phone at the ready the entire conflict, held it high. "It's all on tape. Would you like to see it?" he offered loudly, looking directly at one of the officers. The senior patrolman frowned and shifted his gaze to Randolph, then to Jessica, who was standing next to her dog. She no longer looked frightened. Her face was tired, but there was determination and dignity in her eyes. "Miss, can you explain what happened here?" the patrolman asked calmly. Jessica stepped forward. Her voice was firm, but not angry. "This officer pulled me over for no reason. He provoked me, threatened me and my dog. When I tried to defend myself with words, he became aggressive. Bruno was only defending me from the attack." Her words sounded clear and confident, and the crowd backed her up with an approving roar. "It's all lies," Randolph shouted, but his voice was no longer convincing. He looked around for support, but people just shook their heads. "I've got it all on tape, officer," the teenager said, handing the phone to the older patrolman. "You can see for yourself." The patrolman silently picked up his phone and began watching the video. Other officers gathered around him. An eerie silence enveloped the crowd as everyone waited for their reaction. When the video ended, the patrolman looked up at Randolph. There was disappointment in his gaze. "Officer Randolph," he said coldly, "we will investigate. But we can already see that you violated protocol and used your position to intimidate." Randolph opened his mouth to say something, but hesitated. His own co-workers, the crowd, even the teenagers with their phones were staring at him. He felt his world crumbling. "It was a mistake," he shouted, but his voice sounded pitiful, as if he couldn't believe his own words. "A mistake?" came a voice from the crowd. It was a man in a suit. "It's not a mistake, it's your nature." And finally, everyone saw it. Jessica stood silent. She didn't smile, didn't rejoice at his humiliation. Her face expressed only calmness and strength. She realized that this moment was no longer about her. It was his downfall, and she wasn't going to stoop to his level to gloat. "You're lucky Bruno didn't hurt you more," she said, looking directly at Randolph. Her voice was quiet, but each letter was like a hammer blow. "But his actions were caused by your behavior. If you had acted with respect, this wouldn't have happened." Randolph lowered his head, avoiding her gaze. For the first time in the entire conflict, he looked truly broken. His strength, his power, all evaporated in an instant. The senior patrolman turned to Jessica. "We'll get this incident under control, miss. If you'd like, you can file a complaint. I'll personally make sure it's dealt with." "Thank you," she replied briefly. The officers began to sort through the crowd, asking witnesses, gathering evidence. One of them helped Randolph up and took him to the side where he sat on the curb with his arms around his head. The crowd, which at first had been a silent observer, now began to disperse. But before leaving, many approached Jessica to show their support. "You were brave," the man with the briefcase said, shaking her hand. "We are happy that this man got what he deserved," the elderly woman added. "Thank you," Jessica replied. Her voice sounded calm, but inside she could feel the tension leaving her body. When the crowd had finally dispersed and Bruno was sitting at her feet, Jessica looked at Randolph. He was still sitting on the curb with his arms around his head. He no longer looked menacing. There was nothing left of the cocky cop who had threatened her just a few minutes ago. She could have said something. She could have reminded him of his mistakes or added to his shame, but instead she just turned and walked away, leaving him alone to face the consequences of his actions. Justice doesn't always come through revenge. Sometimes it is about letting a person see how low they have fallen. The sun was slowly slipping toward sunset, casting the parking lot in a soft golden light that contrasted with the gravity of the events. People had dispersed, leaving only Jessica, her faithful dog Bruno, and the officers finishing up their reports. In the distance, on the edge of the sidewalk, sat Officer Randolph. His figure, once confident and fearful, now looked pathetic and lonely. Randolph sat with his head bowed. His tattered uniform and bandaged arm were a mute testament to his humiliation. He was breathing heavily, avoiding looking at Jessica or his co-workers. He knew that in that moment, everyone could see him as he was afraid to recognize himself. Weak, pathetic, a broken man who had lost control of the situation. Every movement was painful, but the wounds on his body were nothing compared to the wounds on his pride. There was no longer the crowd around him that had silently obeyed his authority before. Now his words no longer carried weight. His threat no longer inspired fear. Everything he had relied on had crumbled like sand. Thoughts whirled through his mind. How had he let this happen? How had things gotten so out of control? He remembered his defiance, his harsh words, the moment he'd first decided to humiliate Jessica for his own pleasure. He'd always thought people like her could never stand up to him. To him, this was just another day to prove his superiority. But now, everything was different. He saw Jessica looking at him, not with fear, as he was used to, but with contempt. And that was worse than any physical blow. He felt his hatred and prejudice turn against himself. "What did I do?" he whispered under his breath, but there was no answer. He had thought that he had always done the right thing, that his actions served the law. But now he realized that was a lie he had been telling himself to justify his behavior. He was using the uniform to suppress, not protect. Jessica stood next to Bruno, stroking his head. The dog sat still, his tail wagging slightly, as if he knew it was over. Jessica looked at Randolph. She saw his face, haggard, broken, but still full of anger and shame. Her first inclination was to say something, to throw in his face all the humiliation he'd put her through. But, looking at him, she realized she didn't need to. He'd already been punished. His wounds aren't just physical. Her words would only add salt to his already deep wound. "We're leaving, Bruno," she said, her voice sounding soft. She turned around, her steps slow but sure. Bruno walked beside her, his tail swaying calmly from side to side. She knew she didn't have to be afraid anymore. This moment not only freed her from the fear of the likes of Randolph, but it showed the strength she had found within herself. Randolph looked up and watched her walk away. Her silhouette seemed to symbolize everything he'd lost that day: respect, power, confidence. He felt a wave of bitterness rising inside, but it wasn't directed at Jessica or her dog. It was directed at himself. "You deserve it," came a voice behind him. It was one of his colleagues. The young officer, who had just been watching, now came closer. "You thought you'd always get away with it," he continued, "but it was bound to happen sooner or later." Randolph didn't answer. His colleague shook his head and walked away, leaving him alone. The sun had finally disappeared over the horizon, and the coming evening enveloped the parking lot in a chill. Randolph, sitting on the sidewalk, suddenly realized that it was all over. His career, his reputation, had been destroyed by his own hands. He looked at the asphalt, at the boot marks where Jessica had stood, and at the spot where her dog had stood in defense of his mistress. That place was now forever etched in his memory. Randolph closed his eyes, trying to find some foothold in his soul. He remembered everything: how he'd looked down at Jessica, how he'd talked to her, how he'd threatened her dog. Every moment was like a punch in the face, but he knew those blows were fair. He was no longer the man who felt powerful. Now he was just a shadow of himself, forced to live with the realization that his actions had led to this moment. His hands trembled, but he clenched his fists, trying to suppress the weakness. He knew he had punishment ahead of him, official and internal. But he also knew he would never forget this day. A day when a dog, a person, and the truth proved stronger than his bias and cruelty. This lesson, though painful, is one he will remember for the rest of his life. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. We value each and every one of you, and your feedback helps make our content even better. If you like this story, subscribe to our channel and give us a like so you don't miss new stories that make you think. Thank you for staying with us. We wish you a good day and justice in every moment.